If you're a certain age and you're a wrestling fan, Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff was the pinnacle to you.
Mr. Wonderful was a key piece in the foundation of WWE.
Remembered for his epic feud with Hulk Hogan, Paul Orndorff thrilled audiences as the arrogant heel, Mr. Wonderful.
Mr. Wonderful, the man that defied the whole wrestling world.
Mr. Wonderful was this expression of his perfection.
This is what the most wonderfulest body looks like.
Paul was a rock star.
Mr. Wonderful.
A gifted athlete, Orndorff channeled a difficult upbringing into an imposing persona in and out of the ring.
When that switch flipped, there was a price to pay for making Paul Orndorff mad.
People feared him. The talent feared him. The fans feared him.
Paul was the toughest guy that I had ever witnessed. He fought for everything that he got.
The intensity that defined him pushed his body to the brink and hid his private pain.
Hang in there, hang in there.
He was the closest thing to Superman without the cape, but the cumulative effect of age and injuries had taken a toll on him.
Orndorff has suffered some sort of neck injury in the ring.
It was hard to watch him physically deteriorate.
You could see how much Paul had aged. He shouldn't look like that. He had been abused and neglected for a long time.
He was in the hospital. I said, I'm taking him home. And they said, you can't, and there's nothing we can do. This is a joke, right? People were dying alone in the hospital during COVID. That's not happening. I'm gonna raise holy hell. And I had no idea how, but he was coming home with me.
When Travis posted that video, I said, why would you do this? Paul deserved his privacy.
Wow. You're putting this out of your dad. Do not embarrass him in front of the whole world.
I didn't know what to do. I was desperate. I wasn't trying to embarrass him, I was trying to save him.
Why are you here? What's the big deal here?
What's the big deal? Excitement.
This is the sport of the 80s. This is the media event of 1985.
This is WrestleMania. This is the thing of today. Hulkamania is running wild.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to WrestleMania.
Pandemonium breaking loose here at Madison Square Garden. In WrestleMania, we're seeing the greatest spectacle in wrestling history right now.
WrestleMania 1 was Vince McMahon's big gamble.
Hello, everyone. This is Vince McMahon.
There had never been a nationally broadcast, mega closed-circuit event in every market in the United States to blend pro wrestling and pop culture. He had to have the promotion right, the card right. He loaded the thing up with the biggest attraction that he could.
Ladies and gentlemen, our main event.
Hulk Hogan and Mr. T against Roddy Piper and Paul Orndorff. They were in the spot of the main event of the biggest grossing wrestling event of all time.
Piper and Orndorff, you dead meat. You dead meat, and I pity you, fool.
Everybody went into this thing with some pressure on them because this had not been done before on this level.
The biggest match in the history of wrestling.
Why was Paul Orndorff there? Because he was an elite level wrestler.
Suplex, he got him.
He could work with a guy like Mr. T that was greener than a pepper tree and didn't know what he was doing. He could put all of Hulk Hogan's stuff over. And then when it came time, he was the guy to get beat. The event was such a success that people have forgotten the fact that Orndorff was the key, because who else is going to do the job of those four guys? Only Paul. That's how Vince McMahon hoped to, and eventually did, get a leg up on the rest of the wrestling world and take it over by creating WrestleMania.
He wanted to take over the world, and he did. I think it changed the whole course of wrestling. And in fact, I know it did.
Does my dad get all the credit he deserves? He gets the credit he deserves from the people that watched it. The people that go back and watch wrestling very much appreciate his work. My name is Travis Orndorff, and I'm the son of Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff. I certainly inherited his intensity.
Everybody out there knows what kind of a man I am.
You know, Dad moved and he was either go or stop. His evolution to Mr. Wonderful was this progression of his history, his intensity, and all of that coming together. As I think most good hero stories are, they come from very humble beginnings and a pretty rough childhood.
There's no doubt that Paul's upbringing made him the tough guy that he was. I mean, I'm B. Brian Blair, and Paul Orndorff was one of my closest friends for many years. Paul's home wasn't in a trailer park, and he actually grew up in a converted chicken coop.
My grandfather was a butcher. The life of a butcher, it's not like there was a lot of money. Modest would be an upgrade. They were poor.
I'll never forget when his dad came to my house and the tears started coming from his eyes, and he said, I did the best that I could. I thought I grew up tough. Paul really grew up tough.
There's one story, Dad had worked some job, and when he came home with cash, my grandmother, she asked for the money, and he told her no, he wasn't giving her the money, it was his money. And so she knocked him out with a cast iron skillet and took the money.
His own mother?
Yes.
You know, he fought for everything that he got. He was in an area where people fought on a regular basis. It was like part of their lifestyle growing up.
My grandfather was a drinker. My dad bare knuckle fought to pay his bar tab on occasion. You know, he had a lot of anger.
I've seen Paul in lots of fights, and he never lost one. One night, his brother Terry got into a situation in a bar, calls Paul, and says, I need some help. Paul runs into this bar. There's two sheriffs that have Terry down, and Terry's screaming. Paul, boom, nails one of them, nails the other one. One guy's on the ground. He calls for backup. In comes 5 more sheriffs. They try to grab Paul. Paul nails all of them. This is one guy, one man, and 7 sheriffs.
That was his outlet, but sometimes you can't put that genie back in the bottle. You combine the fact that there's poverty, there's alcohol, there's anger, and my dad was forged in hell.
Despite the chaos at home, Paul has a gift that will change everything.
Since he was very, very young, Paul was one of the greatest athletes to ever come out of Tampa, Florida.
Paul was a true believer in my athletic ability will carry me as forward as I can go. I'm Jerry Briscoe, WWE Hall of Famer, and I've spent a lot of time with Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff. And Paul definitely thought his way out was football.
Dad graduated at 18 years old, and he went on to the University of Tampa.
Paul got a full ride there. He was number 40, the fullback. He got drafted by the New Orleans Saints, played there for 4 years.
Really kind of lost my heart for football. I played it all my life and just didn't care for it anymore. And I happened to be watching TV and catch his wrestling.
Thank you very much, and welcome again to Championship Wrestling from Florida.
And I said, oh, I can do that. My father-in-law knew Eddie Grant, and he gave me a tryout.
So he brought him in and, of course, put him right with Hiro Matsuda.
From Yokohama, Japan, Hiro Matsuda.
Hiro Matsuda wrestled as a villain for Eddie before he became the trainer. So Hiro's job was to train the new prospective talent.
It was the Harvard of professional wrestling. And Hiro would just put me through it. But I had that drive, you know, I had the heart for it. It sounds like I'm bragging, I guess I am, but it's the truth.
3 summers that I had with Matsuda, over 100 people came there, and the only people that made it through the camp was Hogan, myself, and Mr. Wonderful, Paul Orndorff. That's all. So we just had a natural bond.
After making his mark in Florida, Paul now sets his sights on building a reputation across the country.
I had never heard the name Paul Orndorff before in my life. When he came into Memphis with that look and that style and that athleticism, this guy is something special. I'm Jim Cornette, and I took the picture for Paul Orndorff's first wrestling magazine cover in 1977. He didn't have a gimmick. He didn't have an over-the-top personality. You could kind of buy him as being this hotshot athlete that's come in and is going to take over.
Paul was one of those guys that looked like a bodybuilder, but was smooth like an amateur wrestler. I'm Arn Anderson, the enforcer. Paul Orndorff was my friend. Paul carried himself with just this air of invincibility about him. If nothing else, he believed his own press. And sometimes that's all you need.
Very quick, really can't move. Orndorff.
Paul worked all the major territories in the first 3 or 4 years of his career, and he progressed quickly.
What really made Paul click was that desire to better himself and to bring his family up out of poverty.
My mom and dad met at high school. My mom, Rhonda, she got pregnant at the age of 17, and they got married. They're very young. My brother is Paul Orndorff III.
It's Paul Jr., and they called him Buzz.
He's 9 years older. So we had the same parents, but they were different parents, right? My mom, those years were hard on her. There was a lot of moving. There was not a lot of money. Dad carried baggage from his childhood. He had a short fuse at times. You know, he had not grown up. They didn't have therapy back then. You worked, you drank, and you just lived life, and nobody said anything about anything, and you moved on. That's where you forge bitterness and resentment.
It's so hard to raise a family when you're on the road. You know, the wife's at home, and the kids have no dad.
My mom took her frustration out on everybody. She was constantly, you know, talking bad about my father. It was rough. My dad was never perfect, but as a father, he was unconditionally loving, and I never felt like he was that far away.
In 1983, Hulk Hogan recommends Paul to Vince McMahon, opening the door to the hottest promotion in the country.
The topic of this week's update, a gentleman known in professional wrestling as Mr. Wonderful, Paul Orndorff.
In late 1983, Vince McMahon was starting the national television syndication that would lead to the WWF's national expansion. Hogan's word carried a lot of weight with Vince because Vince was building the entire company around Hogan, and he wanted to bring in people that Hogan liked to wrestle, that he thought he could draw money with, and one of the guys that he brought in was Paul Orndorff.
Introducing the challenger, Mr. Wonderful.
Paul checked every box that he could possibly check except the experience box. So it was kind of a roll of the dice.
You got to take gambles in life. And I did. And it paid off.
Paul was in the WWF within 5 or 6 years after he started, and he'd already been a main event guy in a variety of big promotions. That's a very quick trajectory.
Mr. Wonderful.
Paul took the name Mr. Wonderful because in his heel persona, it indicated that he was a megalomaniac, that he was the most self-absorbed man on the planet.
Hello, Mr. Wonderful.
This is the kind of treatment that Mr. Wonderful gets.
One of my favorite lines is, so with a body like this and a face like this.
When you got a body like this and a face like this, you can do any damn thing you want to do, and I'll get away with it.
He saw his body as a temple. For him, that was his paycheck.
A lot of people try to have a body like this, but they never will.
Paul was a stud. I mean, he had to have his hair blow-dried perfect.
Paul Mitchell hairspray. If I ever get cancer, it's going to be from having to have smelled that my entire childhood.
Oh, look at that. It's terrible.
There's a reason my dad loved being a heel. Anger is the easiest emotion to evoke.
Oh, he's giving a sign for the pile driver.
The pile driver was Paul's signature finishing move.
Got him upside down now.
He could get a massive jump and then boom, drove him. It was one of the most deadly moves in wrestling.
I knew my style was different, and I would be the best heel there, which I was.
Dropping him like yesterday's newspaper.
So that cockiness and arrogance just went along with that body.
And all you women that are ready to leave your husband for me, now you know why. That was me. It wasn't fake. I mean, that was me. That's the way I was. Ask my wife. She'll tell you. I was a jerk.
I think Rhonda wasn't stupid when it came to realizing that her husband wasn't the loyal husband.
I was out on the road sometimes, and I can remember being at different hotels, and The groupies and the women standing outside, you gave them money and you gave them fame and all the things that come with it. I don't think my family was immune to it any more than anybody else was.
Girls were throwing themselves at you all the time. I mean, it was like being a rock star.
Following the success of WrestleMania,
In WrestleMania, it was your shoulders that were pinned to the ground, brother, not me.
Vince McMahon recasts Paul Orndorff as a hero, aligning him with Hulk Hogan.
Mr. Wonderful wants Hulkster to shake hands.
Imagine, especially in the 80s, you have seen Hulk Hogan rise to become the champion, and all the little Hulkamaniacs are on his side, and suddenly he has a friend. And you like the friend too.
Mr. Wonderful!
They were on his side because he was a straight-ahead, all-American athlete.
Just as Mr. Wonderful reaches the peak of his popularity, an injury in the ring stops him cold.
He was in a match. Somebody caught him on the chin. It ended up causing nerve damage that ran through his radial nerves.
It affects your deltoids, your tricep, bicep, comes all the way down into your forearm. Once you have serious nerve damage, it's irreversible.
He could not bring himself to give up that spot and that kind of money to have surgery. And so he soldiered through it.
He had built his body and life around this moment where he was going to capture generational wealth.
Despite the nagging injury, Paul prepares for his most important storyline yet.
I've been trying to call him 5 or 6 minutes. I've been on the phone. He won't come to the phone.
One of the biggest drawing angles you can do is give the hero a sidekick, a best friend, a partner, and he stabs him in the back.
Oh, no!
During the heel turn, he does what my dad does. He does a pile driver on him.
You gotta be... No! No!
You know, he walks over the ropes and this real slow. How do you like that?
When Orndorff turned on Hulkster, that was a monumental spot for the wrestling industry.
Hulk Hogan!
I loved working with Terry. He made me the hottest heel in the country, and I made him the hottest babyface in the country.
Everything about it clicked. Everything started exploding, and they were just hot.
Man, for 6 months this feud has gone on.
You sold out a country, man. You sold out all those people that believed in you, man.
Now all the little Hulkamaniacs and the big Hulkamaniacs, they all wanted to see Hulk Hogan get even with the guy that betrayed him.
I mean, I had death threats and everything else, man. Bottles and darts thrown at me.
Wrestling fans are a whole nother level. It is crazy how driven, motivated, and in love they are with these characters. I had a friend that quit talking to me when I was like 8 years old. And a few years later, I am so sorry I hated you. Your dad turned on Hulk Hogan.
I am the most unpopular person in the world. Well, that is an achievement right there.
When they decided to do the big event at the Canadian National Exhibition in Toronto, over 60,000 people went to Exhibition Stadium to see Hulk Hogan versus Paul Orndorff.
You know why it worked? Everybody in that building believed Orndorff could beat Hogan. They believed.
Oh, he's tapped to the shoulder of Orndorff.
That was the biggest crowd in the history of wrestling in North America to that point. Here's a guy that grew up in a fucking trailer that they used to use as a chicken coop. Now he's facing the top star in the business, and he's making $25,000 a week, which is the equivalent of almost $100,000 a week today.
I didn't go in here blinded. I mean, I had a plan. I truly had a plan for once in my life that it worked. I was told I was going to make money. And when Mr. McMahon said you're going to make money, you will make money.
He was absolutely on top of the world.
There he is, right there.
That was a job. And it was a job that took him away from me. And I wanted my dad home. I don't remember at that period ever going without anything. I can tell you I went to one of the top private schools at the time. Everything was paid off. You remember the old red Tupperware? We had those in the freezer, and there was like money stacked in there, and like one of them fell out and like broke my toe. My mom, she liked the money of wrestling, and she didn't have to work. She had been diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, and it was genuinely severe. This happened in the late 80s, and then, the pills started.
Unfortunately, when he was sending his money home, his wife was spending it all on the wrong things, on drugs and other things.
It was often just me and my mom. She wouldn't wake up on time to take me to school. There was this evolution of pain medication, and, it just continued, and it continued the rest of her life.
The relentless schedule leaves Paul little time at home with Rhonda and their sons, or to deal with his worsening injury.
There were a few weeks where the WWF was selling in excess of 150,000 tickets in a week to see Hogan and Orndorff wrestle. And it was a double-edged sword.
I'd get 2 or 3 days off, and Vince would track me down and want me to come back to work. When you main event, you can't. You gotta go. And I was going hurt, burnt out, tired, flying all day and getting to the gym, and I was working 18 hours a day, man. I did that for 3 years. I got a family to feed.
Dad was still on the road. He was injured, and I got deathly ill. I went from 83 pounds to 52 pounds in about 3 weeks. Dad didn't see me every day, but they would bring in a cot, and when he'd come into town, he'd sleep in my room with me. I lost the ability to walk. My hands quit working. My body kind of shut down. The best answer I've gotten is a complex regional pain syndrome, but at the time, they really didn't think I was going to live. So the doctor, at his own wit's end, said, "We think your son has a brain tumor." My dad grabbed him by the collar, pinned him up against the wall, and said, "He doesn't have a effing brain tumor." In that moment, he was angry and he was scared. And he didn't want to lose his baby boy.
I think that always hurt Paul, that he couldn't be around his kids more, but he couldn't do both. And he chose what was going to at least feed him, clothe him, and hopefully he would make amends when he retired.
By 1988, you couldn't ignore it anymore. His arm was atrophying, it was getting smaller, it was affecting his work.
You looked at his 2 arms and it was like 2 different people.
He was very depressed about his arm, about the business, about Rhonda, about money, about so many different things, and he's using, whether it was drugs or women, whatever crutch he could find to escape the moment.
Vince had made my dad a promise when he got hurt. He said, don't screw me, and you'll have a job here the rest of your life. And my dad screwed him.
After a severe nerve injury to his arm, Paul Orndorff walks away from wrestling, burning a bridge with the promoter who made him famous.
The way my dad left WWF when he did, he upset Vince.
He no-showed Vince McMahon and the WWF after asking for days off that he didn't get. Paul was a guy that if he felt he wasn't being treated fairly, that he would take matters in his own hands.
Did you and Vince leave on good terms?
No. No. I got buried. I think that people got his ears that tell him I didn't get hurt. I was hurt. I mean, I was hurt. It was obvious I was hurt. It was time to go.
And at that point, he's almost 40 years old. He had made a lot of money over the previous few years. That's when he decided to retire for the first time from wrestling.
He wanted to get away from the business for a while. He wanted to heal.
He bought a bowling alley and worked it like a business.
My dad knew nothing about bowling, but when my dad left WWF, he had started to invest with a financial advisor named Shelton Thorne down in Florida, somebody he knew from a dentist where my mom worked. And so he trusted my mom and he trusted Shelton. They got some investors together and they opened a bowling center.
I thought that was very unique, that a guy of his magnitude would buy a bowling alley.
That's Travis Orndorff. Paul's little son there.
My dad said, my identity is not in wrestling. My identity is not in Mr. Wonderful. My identity is your daddy. And my identity is what I do.
Paul had been so visible in the WWF that when he retired, somebody actually started a rumor that he was dead, and it was picked up internationally.
To get calls at my bowling center, I think somebody said I died on steroids. Shh, that's stupid. I was home. I hadn't been home in 20 years, man.
At home, things are far from quiet. Paul's eldest son falls into a life of crime and addiction.
Buzz is Paul's first son, his older son, and Buzz has been in a lot of trouble.
You know, alcohol was involved, DUIs, substance use.
Paul Orndorff III has been arrested again here in Peachtree City after another high-speed chase.
I'm not better than my brother. We had different circumstances.
Paul did everything he could to love Buzz, to give him a chance, to forgive him, and all that. Buzz would always turn the wrong way.
The funny thing is he could be the nicest and sweetest person in these moments. You would get your hopes up, but they just were short-lived. My parents ended up adopting my brother's children. I think I was 13 at that point. You know, by the time his kids were born, my parents were raising him. You know, we were going to visit the prisons he was in every Saturday or every other Saturday.
But the trouble at home puts Paul's family and their financial security at risk.
All the money that Paul had made in the WWF that he had ignored his injury for, his business manager, they found out, was a crook and had been running some kind of Ponzi scheme, and his money was gone.
Shelton was getting money from this place to pay this investor as they were going, and it eventually folded. My dad was sued by the investors as well. You know, they didn't win because we didn't have anything.
It hurts your pride because you think you have all your bases covered, and then you get swindled by a person that you gave your trust to.
Shelton Thorne basically bankrupts him, and there's no paycheck coming every month. There's no insurance. He's in a very difficult situation, and he's got to make a choice to go back on the road again and make a living the only other way he knows how. I'm sure it was very emotionally difficult on Paul.
You could tell that it had taken something out of him. And then from there, things just got worse.
You have not seen the last of me. You know, I've gotten letters, I've gotten phone calls from all over the world. People want to know, is it true that Mr. Wonderful has died? Well, I want everybody out there to know that I am alive and well.
2 years after walking away from the WWF with permanent injuries, Orndorff is scammed out of his life savings, forcing him back into the ring.
He knew that the independents were hot. There were places for Paul to go.
When he popped back up in 1990, he went about the UWF and some different independent promotions over the next couple of years. He still looked like Paul Orndorff.
I'm coming after you, Herb.
You would never know he was hurt. Didn't affect his work at all.
You could tell if you looked close that there was a little something going on with the arm, but otherwise than that, he looked just as good as he always did. By 1992, I was running Smoky Mountain Wrestling, based out of Knoxville, Tennessee.
First of all, I want to ask a favor of all these genetic mutants out here. You got to keep the noise down.
I called him. I said, would you like to come in and work some weekends for me? And he said yes, for a very agreeable rate.
At some point, it's your job. It's not in stadiums. It's not to sell out crowds, and nothing like the WWF was at that time.
The UWF merchandise is the talk of the town.
These guys paid for his name, and Dad could still work, and he tried to keep his left arm in front of the camera instead of his right arm, and he did what he had to do to take care of his family.
There is a man on a mission right there.
In 1993, Paul changes course, signing with wrestling's most ambitious promotion.
WCW in the mid-90s was they were trying to imitate Vince McMahon's WWF with the entertainment aspect and the celebrities aspect and the glitz and glamour aspect. However, they didn't have the brain power.
But here comes RoboCop, Bob!
WCW's celebrity angles involved D-list people that were on reality shows or on late-night commercials. One of them was a psychic.
Gary Spivey?
of the Psychic Companions Network? What are you doing here?
I got a vision.
He was on TV everywhere at 4 o'clock in the morning predicting the future.
I know you're not okay.
How did you know that?
I got a vision.
I don't know why he couldn't have seen that this angle was going to be the shits.
You're Mr. Wonderful.
I am Mr. Wonderful.
He had lost who Mr. Wonderful was, and he needed to fall back in love with Mr. Wonderful and kissing the handheld mirror. I hated that gimmick so bad.
So Paul was, again, performing at a high level, doing everything expected of him, but 1990s, WCW was just so low budget and so silly and so directionless. It was just low rent.
Thank you, Gary.
If you want to figure out why that happened, Paul was getting paid. That's it.
Still in constant pain from nerve damage, by 1999, Orndorff moves behind the scenes as a trainer for WCW.
While Paul was at WCW, they instituted a wrestling school in-house called the Power Plant, where they would try to train the next generation of their athletes. And Paul was a perfect fit for that.
I may have 15 or 20 kids down every 2 to 3 weeks. What I try to do is to get the best athlete as I possibly can.
Paul took that very seriously, and he would teach him just the way that he was taught.
He wanted to hand off his legacy to these next generation wrestlers.
Paul had been training guys for some time when the idea came up for an elimination match where Paul would get back in the ring. And the premise of it was that he was wrestling against some of the young guys that he had been training at the Power Plant.
Paul told me that he didn't want to go out there. Yet they insisted that he go out.
Well, I don't mind telling you, Paul Orndorff has been hit a lot of times in his career. He doesn't mind taking a few more.
For a normal 50-year-old man, he looks in great shape, but see, the arms are so much smaller.
Into the ropes. Oh, no.
Now here's the first pile driver. He hadn't got him all the way straight. He didn't get the jump that he used to, but he stuck him and it was safe. Here comes Jindrak. 6'5", 250 pounds, couldn't wrestle out of a wet paper bag. He goes to power drive him. Jindrak tries to go up too quick. Now he got sideways, and they went down backwards.
If I would have came down where I was with him, it would have dropped him right on his head. But if you let your legs go that way, don't work.
The weight and the velocity made it kind of like a rear-end car accident from a different angle.
And I hit the ring, my whole right side went numb.
Paul, laying there, had to tell the referee, "I'm hurt, I can't get up."
Ladies and gentlemen, due to a serious injury to Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff, referee Charles Robinson has stopped this match. It is a no contest.
A stinger is like a knockout punch to your nerve. Sting goes through your entire body, like an electric shock, and then you got nothing. When you recover, you get all the feeling back in your extremities. If it doesn't work out that way, then you're paralyzed.
Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff has suffered some sort of neck injury.
He had broken his neck. They stopped the match and called an ambulance.
It's very rare that you stop a match on television. It never happened in those days.
A standing ovation for Paul Orndorff and the fans.
It's difficult when you're hanging on wrestling at 51 years old and gets hurt doing his own move.
That was the sign that the neck had gotten too bad and there was no way he could do this anymore at all.
It was God telling him, "You're done."
From then on, things he could do were very limited physically. The pain was unrelenting for most of his life after that.
I had another operation on my neck, which was the third one. I got to fuse it, take out 2 discs, and put a rod in it. My body ain't not very good right now. It's hurt as we speak.
And we didn't see him for, God, long time.
In 2005, Paul returns to the public eye, enjoying the fans' appreciation of his legendary career.
To see him go back and be in the WWE Hall of Fame was the icing on the cake. If anybody deserved it, Paul deserved it.
Would truly like to say I thank you fans very much. It means a lot.
In 2005, he looked great. He was still himself, but I noticed a decline in his memory. When it hit about 2010, it accelerated from like 0 to 100 when he got cancer, throat cancer.
He knew he had a battle between life and death, and he got through that cancer. But,
Is that you, Paul Orndorff? No, it's Rudolph.
It's just my memory. It's not what it used to be. You know, this cancer and this chemo and radiation just messed my, you know.
He would call me over and over and over again and not remember we had just talked. Then I was like, oh my God. Like, I wouldn't even know he was going on these conventions, and I think he got lost at the airport one time. And as I'm telling people this, they're, oh, he's fine. And I'm like, no, he's not.
As Paul's dementia symptoms increase, so does the instability of his life at home.
Whenever I was in Atlanta, I always tried to stop and go see Paul. As soon as I saw him, I knew that he was being abused. The man I know was skin and bones and scars and bruises. His wife was not giving him his medicine, not taking care of him. She was getting strung out on drugs, and she was doing meth, and she was in pitiful shape. It was sad, very, very sad. A few years before Paul had full onset dementia, he was, you know, not in the best shape. Unfortunately, Buzz got out of prison, and Buzz hit him and broke his nose. You know, how he could hit his own father, I don't know, but...
I didn't know what to do. I picked him up from that house, and I took him home to my house. I made every attempt to get him to move in with me, but he wanted to go home, and he would ask for Rhonda. He wouldn't leave her. Like, I tried multiple times. He needed care, and at that point, she wasn't willing to do that. And that was the first time I called Adult Protection Services. But you have zero control over it. Zero.
He was in bad shape. He didn't know what was going on. And then, unfortunately, you know, the pandemic came in. That was about the end of it.
In 2021, Paul is hospitalized with pneumonia. When he's ready to be discharged, Rhonda refuses to take him back.
I got my mom to tell me where my dad was. And they point in the room, and I walk in. And it was hairs all out, long. His leg is shaking. He's nonverbal. It absolutely overwhelmed me. I said, I'm taking him home. They said, you can't. And I said, why not? They said, you're not listed as next of kin. And she said, listen, we've been trying to call your mom for the last, several months, saying that it's time he needed to go home. She's been unwilling to assist, and there's nothing we can do. And I said, get me a social worker. They said, it won't matter. And I said, I'm gonna raise holy hell until you do something. And I said, I'm gonna take a video.
Do you remember wrestling? Daddy, you're just eating the pepper.
To see a guy that had been that vibrant and that strong and that powerful.
It broke my heart then, and it breaks my heart now. You just can't stand the sight of it.
The worst video I've ever seen in my entire life. I was furious with his son.
I was very upset, and I called Travis. Why would you want to put your dad in that light? He's a very proud person. This is nobody else's business, Travis.
And he's like, take that down. And I said, no, I'm not doing it. And he's like, Dave Meltzer just posted. And I'm like, who is Dave Meltzer? Why would I care what this guy said? That was a plea. I was desperate. I was scared to death. They were saying like people were dying alone in the hospital during COVID. I'm like, that's not happening. It's not happening.
I don't know if you could have been bigger than Paul Orndorff, but even if you're a Superman, at one point, it doesn't make it any easier. He didn't know where he was. You could tell it was Paul, but Paul wasn't there anymore.
After posting a video of his father's deteriorating condition in the hospital, Travis faces backlash from the wrestling world.
Wrestlers were upset, the community, the brotherhood, as if I had betrayed him, showing him in this state. And I will tell you what I think my father would say. If he saw it, he'd be mad. And the next day he'd say he did the right thing. Because he taught me how to make the right decision, even if it wasn't the decision he would make. But he always supported me. I got a phone call from the social worker a couple days later, got a couple apologies, sat down with the doctor, and the doctor said, listen, he doesn't have much time left. I said, okay, well then he's coming home with me. And I took him home. Best decision of my life.
Now that I know that Travis used the video to try to get his dad out during COVID, makes a lot more sense, because that was deplorable. It was absolutely deplorable. And the bottom line is he got his dad out of there, and that's a good thing.
I think he was waiting for me. His brother and sister and my cousin came up, my niece, my nephew, my kids, myself. Got to spend time with him every day. I allowed my mom to come visit. She would spend an hour with him, and then she would go home.
I had talked to Paul less than a week before he passed, and he could barely talk. Travis said that he got real excited when he said it was me on the phone, and kind of took that as a great feeling of true friendship, that he would remember me.
I used to sell Cokes in the Tampa Stadium and watch Paul play football. He was your hero when you were a little kid, right? He was.
You know, I remember hanging up and tears were coming from my eyes. It just reminded me that we're only passing through.
I was with him till every last second. He died with me.
I believe he died in peace, that he wasn't hurting. He just beat me to heaven.
My children have seen me make mistakes, and I'm fortunate I have great relationships with both of them. The conversation I had with my mother later in life, I was angry. The way I was acting towards her was no different than the way she was acting towards my dad. So I was guilty of that. I knew some of my dad's decisions and how it hurt my mom, and I was guilty of that. As time passed, I not only forgave her, but I came to love her. The last gift he left me was his legacy that I would get to share. That first year, people see that we're online, they didn't all comment about my dad. They said, how are you? I'm like, how am I? And they're like, man, we're here for you. And I'm now interacting with these people that I thought I hated. All this anger and resentment I had about the times he was away now has purpose. My dad very much respected the fans that came to see him and the person he was in the ring with. So often what I'll hear is, I was at that event with my father, and they're like, your dad is amazing. And I get to reply, it sounds like your dad was pretty amazing too.
WrestleMania 1, that was his peak. Remember him that night and keep it in your heart. That's the one that you remember.
He did it better than anybody else that ever stepped in that squared circle.
I don't remember anybody having really anything bad to say about Paul Orndorff as a person. In the wrestling business, that may be almost unheard of.
Handsome, sexy, rugged, all the things that he was. Paul was truly Mr. Wonderful.
The pile driver!
People say your dad was an amazing wrestler, and I'm like, and a better father.
Mr. Wonderful, Paul Orndorff.
Wrestling got his body, fans got his mind, and I got his heart.
Broken glass and barbed wire. Believing his suffering was proof that he had created something special. Because of this extreme background, Foley never envisioned himself as a World Wrestling Federation superstar. At the time, the company was far more conservative, promoting a family-friendly, character-driven product that clashed entirely with Foley's violent aesthetic. Al Snow, a former superstar and Foley's closest travel partner, noted that Chairman Vince McMahon initially had zero interest in hiring him. McMahon did not believe Foley was marketable, nor did he find him physically appealing for television. It took the relentless persuasion of Jim Ross, the vice president of talent relations, to get Foley through the door. Ross needed fresh, credible opponents for The Undertaker, who was arguably the biggest star in the history of the business. McMahon had spent years feeding slow, lumbering giants to The Undertaker, a formula that was growing stale. Ross argued that what The Undertaker truly needed was a lunatic. Legend has it that McMahon slammed his hand on a table and finally agreed to hire Foley. But under one strict condition, they would cover his face. McMahon wanted to erase Foley's past, claiming he was a nobody. Thus, the character of Mankind was born. According to Hall of Famer Gerald Briscoe, the creative team was tasked with building a character out of thin air. They strapped a leather mask to his face and introduced a deranged, self-mutilating psychotic who pulled his own hair out in the corner of the ring. It was a concept that would have failed miserably with any other performer. But Foley breathed life into the darkness. He proved that without a genuine connection to the audience, a gimmick is meaningless. Foley became the perfect dancing partner for The Undertaker. He was willing to try absolutely anything to get the character over. The challenge for the agents and producers was no longer getting him to perform. It was actively trying to prevent him from killing himself on live television. The rivalry between Mankind and The Undertaker laid a massive foundation for the company, spanning 7 pay-per-view events and 10 television matches across the globe. However, by the summer of 1998, the Mankind character had plateaued. Foley knew he needed to do something drastic to revitalize his career, something that would cement their legacy rather than detract from it. The opportunity presented itself when producers planned to reignite the feud using a recently developed match concept: Hell in a Cell. Traditionally, a steel cage match required a wrestler to escape over the top or through a door. The innovation of Hell in a Cell was adding a roof, trapping the competitors inside. The inaugural Hell in a Cell match, featuring The Undertaker and Shawn Michaels, was a masterpiece of storytelling and remains a benchmark for the industry. Foley watched that first match in absolute awe, recognizing that he lacked the athletic prowess to replicate the high-flying acrobatics of Shawn Michaels. Facing the daunting task of following a classic, Foley sought advice from his mentor, Terry Funk. During a brainstorming session, Funk jokingly suggested that they start the match on top of the cell and have Foley get thrown off. What started as a dark joke became an obsession. Foley looked at Funk and realized he could actually do it. He could not get the idea out of his head. Foley pitched the concept to The Undertaker and Vince McMahon, casually slipping the idea of being thrown off the roof into the conversation. McMahon was hesitant, entirely against the idea of throwing his talent off a structure of that height. But Foley was dead set, practically selling them on his own demise. He viewed this match not as a glorious second act to his career, but as a desperate measure to keep his head above water, fully believing his time in the spotlight was drawing to a close. The Undertaker trusted Foley. If Foley could see the stunt in his mind, he believed he could execute it safely. But as the bell prepared to ring, the tension was suffocating. No one had ever seen a match carry this much underlying risk. It was a contest where the loser might bypass the hospital and go straight to the morgue. On that fateful night, the Pittsburgh Civic Arena was electric. Jimmy Corderas, a referee and member of the ring crew, watched nervously from the back. Gerald Briscoe sat in the producer's chair, staring intently at a wall of monitors. Commentators Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler were kept completely in the dark, experiencing the horror in real time alongside the fans. Foley's music hit, and instead of entering the cage, he immediately began to scale the outer wall. A wave of confusion and shock washed over the arena. The commentators questioned his sanity. Foley had assured McMahon and The Undertaker that he was comfortable on top of the structure. But the truth was a closely guarded secret. Mick Foley was terrified of heights. As The Undertaker made his legendary slow entrance, Foley stood 20 feet in the air, internally panicking, wondering how he could gracefully climb down without ruining his career. But there was no turning back. The Undertaker scaled the structure to meet him. The sheer physics of the moment immediately betrayed them. The roof of the cell was held together by plastic zip ties. With 600 pounds of human weight moving across the mesh, the panels began to buckle, sagging dangerously with every step. The sound of zip ties snapping echoed through the arena like gunfire. Foley attempted to execute a suplex on the roof, but the Undertaker wisely cut it off. Realizing the structural integrity was failing and they were at risk of falling through the mesh completely by accident, they brawled toward the edge of the cell, directly above the Spanish announce table. From the ground, that table looked like a piece of dollhouse furniture. Jim Ross noted that there was virtually zero margin for error. As they stood on the precipice, the Undertaker grabbed Mankind, hoisted him into the air, and launched a 300-pound man off a 20-foot steel structure. Time seemed to stand still, yet it was over in the blink of an eye. Foley plummeted through the air and crashed violently through the announce table. The sickening thud of human flesh hitting the wood and concrete echoed throughout the arena. The reaction was pure, unadulterated terror. Jim Ross screamed into his headset, asking if they had just witnessed what they thought they saw. In the back, the locker room erupted in horror. Al Snow likened it to watching a fatal car accident. Many genuinely believed Mick Foley had just died on live television. The collective gasp of 16,000 fans sucked the oxygen out of the building. At home, Colette Foley watched in horror alongside her two young children, frantically trying to soothe them by repeating that it was just a television show, while internally fighting off a rising panic. The impact was too violent, too believable to simply brush off as a stunt. Foley's survival came down to a mid-air adjustment. He had visualized the fall and managed to rotate his body just enough to land flat, allowing the table to absorb a fraction of the impact. But the trauma was immense. Hugo Savinovic, the Spanish commentator, had to dive out of his chair to avoid being crushed, later expressing the deep emotional turmoil of watching a friend subject himself to such violence while being professionally obligated not to intervene. Medical personnel, referees, and company officials flooded the ringside area. Terry Funk was the first to reach Foley's side, desperately trying to gauge his consciousness. Dr. Francois Petit, the company's eccentric but highly skilled physician, rushed from the backstage medical area after receiving the frantic call. The situation was chaotic. Foley had landed terribly on his back, dislocating his shoulder in the process. The EMTs struggled to maneuver the gurney to the wreckage, forcing the production crew to raise the massive cell just to clear a path. As Foley was strapped to the gurney, the entire wrestling world exhaled. The match was over. It had to be. But as the gurney rolled toward the entrance aisle, the psychology of the performer overrode the survival instinct of the man. Foley realized that the longer he stayed in the spotlight, the more deeply the audience became invested. Against the frantic pleas of the medical staff, the officials, and his peers, Foley rolled off the gurney. Smiling through a blood-soaked mask, he turned around and marched right back to the cell. The locker room watched in utter disbelief. He was hailed as the toughest, craziest son of a bitch to ever lace up a pair of boots. Foley himself had no idea how he was going to continue the match, but he had made a pledge to deliver a masterpiece, and he was willing to die trying. Foley scaled the cell a second time, dragging his battered body up the steel mesh. The Undertaker met him on the roof once again. The next planned sequence was supposed to be a chokeslam, designed to gradually break a section of the mesh so the Undertaker could eventually stuff Foley through the hole. But gravity had other plans. When the Undertaker elevated Foley and drove him into the steel, the zip ties completely gave way. The panel broke entirely, and Foley plummeted straight down, free-falling into the ring. This was not planned. This was a catastrophic accident. Unlike the first fall, which was somewhat cushioned by the table, Foley hit the solid ring mat, a surface resting over hard wood and steel supports, feeling akin to concrete. But the horror did not end with the impact. As Foley crashed to the mat, a heavy steel folding chair that had been resting on the roof fell through the hole directly behind him, striking him violently in the face upon landing. The arena fell deathly silent. This was not a stunt. This was a man lying motionless, legitimately knocked unconscious for the first time in his career. Panic gripped the production truck. Officials desperately tried to radio Vince McMahon. The Undertaker peered down through the broken roof, later admitting he thought Foley might have died on impact. Dr. Francois Petit and Terry Funk immediately rushed into the ring. The Undertaker looked down at Funk and told him to check if Foley was still breathing. Foley lay unresponsive for 42 agonizing seconds. Recognizing that the entire broadcast had ground to a terrifying halt, Terry Funk proved his genius. To buy the medical team time to assess Foley, Funk provoked The Undertaker, leading to a brief altercation that diverted the cameras and the crowd's attention. It was a masterclass in improvisation under the most extreme pressure imaginable. According to modern medical protocols, the match should have been stopped immediately. But in 1998, the show went on. When Foley finally regained consciousness, the first thing he saw were Terry Funk's shoes. His brain rebooted in the middle of a war zone. Despite having no memory of the fall, he dragged himself to his feet. The visual of mankind rising from the canvas is etched into the annals of sports television. His mask was torn. He had a massive, gaping wound underneath his lip. In a moment of pure, macabre showmanship, Foley pushed his tongue through the hole in his face, smiling a bloody smile for the hard camera. To add to the gruesome imagery, the steel chair had knocked out 2 of his teeth, one of which had traveled through his nasal passage and was visibly lodged in his nose. The pain was undeniable. The concern in the eyes of The Undertaker, the referee, and the officials was entirely real. Yet, Foley refused to quit. In fact, he insisted on executing the final, agonizing sequence of the match. Foley demanded that they bring out the thumbtacks. Thousands of metal tacks were scattered across the ring mat. Operating purely on adrenaline, Foley allowed The Undertaker to chokeslam him directly onto the bed of steel pins, purposely rolling his body to ensure the tacks embedded deeply into his skin. When the body reaches that level of shock, the performer becomes one with the pain, pushing beyond the limits of human endurance. Finally, after 17 minutes of unparalleled carnage, The Undertaker pinned Mankind. The match was over, but the myth was just beginning. The crowd erupted in a mixture of awe and relief. Foley waved off the stretcher a second time, walking back up the aisle under his own power. He had achieved his ultimate goal. He made the audience believe in him. By risking his very life, he forged an unbreakable, emotional bond with the fans. But back home, the silence was deafening. Colette Foley waited agonizing hours for the traditional post-match phone call that assured her he was safe. When the phone finally rang, her relief quickly turned to fury, screaming at him that his children thought he was dead. The trust she had placed in him to protect their family was deeply fractured. Behind the curtain, the locker room was in a state of shock. Vince McMahon approached Foley, expressing deep gratitude for his sacrifice, but issued a stern, unequivocal warning. He made Foley promise never to do anything like that again. As McMahon spoke, the medical team was physically plucking dozens of thumbtacks from Foley's back. Foley, still heavily concussed, famously asked The Undertaker if they had remembered to do the thumbtack sequence, completely unaware that he was covered in them. The physical toll was devastating. A dislocated jaw, a dislocated shoulder, a bruised kidney that plagued him for 6 weeks, missing teeth, 15 stitches in his face. Yet, miraculously, this horrific beating catalyzed a career renaissance. Within 6 months of the company chairman dismissing him as an unmarketable nobody, Mick Foley captured the World Wrestling Federation Championship. But the addiction to the roar of the crowd is a dangerous master. The bar had been raised to an impossible height, and Foley felt a crushing obligation to live up to the moniker of the hardcore legend. Despite McMahon's warnings, Foley continued to push the boundaries of human endurance. Just 7 months later, at the Royal Rumble pay-per-view, Foley pushed his luck again in a brutal I Quit match against The Rock. The bout was designed to be intensely violent, but things quickly spiraled out of control. The script called for Foley to take a series of unprotected chair shots to the head while handcuffed. He had explicitly instructed The Rock not to hold back. He originally anticipated taking 5 shots, but the sequence went off the rails. Foley absorbed 11 horrific, unprotected strikes to his skull with a steel chair. His family sat in the front row. His young children watched their father be systematically destroyed. Noel Foley recalls the trauma of that night, questioning how a normal person could survive 11 blunt force impacts to the brain without dying. It was a sickening display that blurred the line between sports entertainment and aggravated assault. Foley had sacrificed his brain health for a television angle, leaving his peers and his family asking, "Where does it end?" Foley understood that his chosen style would result in chronic pain, deliberately taking moves in the most painful way possible because he believed it looked better for the fans. But the consequences were rapidly catching up to him. Medical professionals strongly advised him to retire, warning him that continuing down this path would leave him permanently crippled. Independent neurologists explicitly told him he had no business ever stepping into a wrestling ring again. Foley suffered concussion after concussion, at times driving around his neighborhood completely unable to remember where he lived. Today, the dark shadow of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, looms heavily over the Foley household. The long-term effects of repetitive brain trauma are a terrifying reality for the family. Noelle Foley admits that the fear of her father's cognitive decline in the next 10 or 20 years is a daily, agonizing worry. Foley himself recognizes the terrifying reality of his past decisions, acknowledging that there is no clear way out of the neurological damage he has accrued. Yet, he refuses to surrender to fear. In an effort to keep his mind sharp, he performs spoken-word tours across the globe, engaging in what he calls mental gymnastics. Standing on a stage, hearing the crowd chant his name, provides the stimulation he needs to keep moving forward. He chooses to appreciate the life he built rather than live in paralyzing fear of the unknown. Through the pain, Foley achieved exactly what he set out to do. He earned the unconditional love and acceptance of millions of strangers. He sacrificed his physique, his safety, and perhaps his long-term health, all for the roar of the crowd. He acknowledges that this relentless pursuit of adulation was his greatest flaw, but also the undisputed architect of his massive success. For years, Foley harbored deep resentment toward Hell in a Cell. It was a dark period where he felt his entire, multifaceted career had been reduced to a single night of violence. It took a quiet conversation with The Undertaker to change his perspective. The Undertaker told him that what they created that night would outlive them both. It was a masterpiece of human endurance that transcended the sport. That realization brought peace. Foley recently visited the company archives alongside his daughter and found himself standing in front of the original Hell in a Cell structure. Touching the rusted steel, the hardened veteran broke down in tears. It was a visceral reminder of the night his life changed forever, and the terrifying reality that it could have easily been the night his life ended. According to Foley, he is incredibly lucky to still be here. He admits that no monetary reward could ever truly cover the risk he took that night. With modern advancements in medical science regarding head injuries, the landscape of wrestling has fundamentally changed. Though Foley himself cannot definitively say he would have altered his path, even if he knew the consequences. To him, the wrestling ring was a canvas, and he used his own blood and bone to create a surreal, terrifying, and sublime form of performance art. It was a career filled with physical potholes and unimaginable trauma. But for a man who desperately wanted to be loved It was a magical way to make a living. On the nights when the story clicked and the crowd erupted in a deafening frenzy, Mick Foley experienced one of the most powerful feelings in the world. The story of Hell in a Cell is not just a story about a wrestling match. It is a haunting psychological study of a man who traded his body for immortality. It forces us to examine the primal, often dangerous relationship between the entertainer and the audience. As the echoes of that June night continue to ring through the decades, the footage remains as a chilling testament to human endurance, leaving every viewer to stare into the abyss and ask the lingering, unanswerable question, was it worth it? Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a profound journey into the shadows of professional wrestling history. We are turning the clock back to June 28, 1998. The stage was the World Wrestling Federation's King of the Ring pay-per-view. On this particular summer night, one matchup would carve its name into the bedrock of sports entertainment as perhaps the most shocking, the most visceral, and the most terrifying encounter ever broadcast to the masses. It was the legendary Undertaker squaring off against Mankind, locked inside the unforgiving, towering steel structure known as Hell in a Cell. To truly comprehend the magnitude of this event, we must first analyze the psychology and the atmosphere of the era. Hell in a Cell is not just a match type, it hits the consciousness like a heavy mallet. According to the accounts of those involved behind the scenes, the energy that night was saturated with an unpredictable, chaotic dread. The two competitors stepping into that ring were notorious for pushing the absolute limits of their physical craft. They were artists of the extreme who liked to ride the razor edge of danger until it tipped over the abyss. Critics and outsiders often point to the scripted nature of professional wrestling. But let me tell you, as anyone who has stood near that ring will testify, you cannot fake gravity. Throughout the decades, many frightening moments have unfolded inside the squared circle. But according to the individuals present that evening, nothing provoked as much pure, unadulterated fear as this match. And that fear would only amplify as the minutes ticked by. What left fans absolutely stunned, frozen in a collective state of disbelief, was the unrelenting, catastrophic punishment that Mick Foley, portraying the deranged character of Mankind, was willing to endure. Until you saw it with your own eyes, you simply would not believe that a human being could physically absorb this level of devastation and live to talk about it. The match was real. The pain was real. The drama was profoundly, uncomfortably real. Backstage, peers and producers were pacing, cursing, screaming, and questioning his sanity. The echoing question reverberating through the arena and the locker room was simple. Why? Why are you doing this? This match remains one of wrestling's most infamous spectacles. The legacy of Hell in a Cell persists today as both an epic television success and a grim cautionary tale. According to industry insiders, the company dodged several metaphorical bullets that day. It is truly staggering to consider that the protocol of the time allowed a competitor to be rendered completely unconscious, only to have the officials continue the broadcast. The collateral damage that ensued from these decisions is an entirely different chapter of the story. It forces us to ask the hard questions. When does it stop? When is it enough? Because ultimately, an athlete pays all day long for the rest of their natural life, for the decisions made during their 15 minutes in the spotlight. It was, without a doubt, a dangerously crazy masterpiece. But all of us, from the commentators to the fans to the executives, need to ask ourselves the ultimate question: was it worth it? To answer that, we have to examine the man behind the mask. Everyone who gets into the grueling business of professional wrestling is usually searching for something they find missing in their own personal lives. For Mick Foley, the root of his incredible pain tolerance was a deeply psychological need for acceptance. According to Foley himself, he was teased mercilessly in his youth, which birthed an overwhelming, almost desperate need to be liked by others. His ultimate goal of capturing the world championship was tied directly to this profound search for validation. Foley often recounts a revealing incident from his sophomore year of college. Seeking the attention of his peers, he took a swig of red food coloring and launched himself off a bed, executing a daring dive onto a stuffed item resting on a solid concrete floor. When he hit the ground, he spat out the fake blood concoction. The reaction from his dorm mates was visceral and immediate. He heard one of the female students yell out that it was the most disgusting thing she had ever seen. But in that moment of absolute disgust, Foley did not feel shame. He felt a profound sense of power. If he could not make people love him conventionally, he reasoned, perhaps he could capture their attention by disgusting them. He simply needed to get reactions. This was the psychological genesis of the man who would become known globally as the hardcore legend, the man who survived Hell in a Cell. Today, for many new viewers, that Hell in a Cell match is the perfect gateway into the industry. Fans constantly cite it as the first match they were ever shown. Yet, the follow-up question is always whether they expected every wrestling match to be that violently extreme, because they certainly are not. However, a normal Mick Foley match was exactly that: hardcore, brutal, and dangerous. His career was defined by blood, scattered thumbtacks, barbed wire, and fire. According to historical footage, he endured being exploded by composition 4 explosives in Japanese death matches, getting speared through flaming tables, and taking horrifying falls directly onto exposed concrete. He willingly subjected his body to an unfathomable amount of trauma. His family provides a heartbreaking perspective on this drive. His daughter, Noelle Foley, reflects that her father simply loved eliciting that shocked, horrified reaction from the crowd. For Foley, realism was his most effective tool. He honestly believed he was not having a good performance unless he had physical trouble walking. Back to his hotel room later that night, it was not that he enjoyed the physical agony itself. Rather, he enjoyed the fact that he could endure it and present it to the audience in a way that was highly entertaining. His wife of over 35 years, Colette Foley, had to ask herself early on if she truly wanted to be mixed up in this chaotic world. When they first met, she looked past the scars and noticed his gentle eyes. She saw a kind person beneath the brutality. It was his corny jokes and terrible sense of humor that won her heart. Fittingly, their wedding song was Beauty and the Beast, a perfect metaphor for the duality of his life. They were a solid team, and she fundamentally understood his unwavering commitment to his craft. She knew that when the adrenaline was pumping through his veins, his singular drive was to ensure the fans left the arena talking about how great the show was, completely at his own physical risk. Before Mankind, Foley developed a deeply chaotic personality known as Cactus Jack. He was a wild, seemingly unhinged competitor. Audiences legitimately wondered if he was insane. But beneath the madness, he possessed an undeniable charisma. You simply could not take your eyes off him. He was entirely different from the traditional muscular athletes of the era. Jim Cornette, who was working as an agent and producer for the World Wrestling Federation at the time, noted that Foley possessed an excellent grasp of in-ring psychology. Foley inherently understood that the fans gravitated towards characters who appeared completely out of control, characters who seemed to be rebelling against the established script. He had a rare ability to take the audience on an emotional ride and elicit the exact response he desired. By constantly crossing the line, the attention remained fiercely focused on him, and his renegade reputation continued to grow. To hone this craft, Foley dedicated himself entirely to the art of the violent spectacle. In his early days, his bedroom furniture consisted merely of a mattress on the floor and a black and white television connected to a video cassette recorder that barely functioned. In that machine were tapes of brutal Japanese wrestling. He would sometimes study those tapes for 12 hours a day. He was captivated by the realism and the unique storytelling where a competitor had to defeat not just their opponent, but the dangerous surroundings themselves. For a long time, Foley believed Japan would be the primary place he made his living. The Japanese promoters were actively looking for a foreign talent who could convincingly feud with the legendary Terry Funk. Terry Funk was widely considered one of the greatest of all time for his unparalleled ability to make an audience suspend their disbelief in an instant. Funk quickly became a mentor to Foley. Together, they engaged in explosive, fiery, incredibly violent death matches across Japan. Foley was naturally drawn to this wild style, literally crawling on his hands and knees through debris, viewing his physical suffering as proof that he had created something truly special. He saw this extreme environment as the one place he could make himself stand out. Because of this brutal reputation, Foley never envisioned himself as a mainstream star in America. At that time, the World Wrestling Federation was not pushing edgy content. It was a highly sanitized, family-friendly era. Foley's violent style simply did not gel with what the company was selling. Al Snow, a former television superstar and Foley's travel partner, provides insight into the corporate resistance. According to Snow, Chairman Vince McMahon adamantly did not want Mick Foley in his company. McMahon did not think Foley was marketable, nor did he find him visually appealing for a television audience. The turning point came through Jim Ross, the vice president of talent relations. Ross needed to secure compelling opponents for the company's top stars, primarily The Undertaker. For years, McMahon had continuously booked giant, lumbering men to face The Undertaker, which often resulted in dull, plodding matches. Ross recognized that what The Undertaker truly needed was a lunatic, someone who would relentlessly attack without fear. Ross heavily advocated for Foley, asking McMahon to trust his evaluation of talent. Eventually, McMahon relented, slamming his hand on a table and agreeing to bring Foley in. But with a strict caveat, they were going to cover Foley's face completely. McMahon wanted to erase Foley's past identity, viewing him as a nobody. This corporate mandate led to the creation of Mankind. According to Hall of Famer Jerry Briscoe, the producers were tasked with building a compelling character out of absolutely nothing. They strapped a leather mask to his face, dressed him in brown rags, and sent him out. This bizarre, disturbing persona would have been a catastrophic failure for almost any other performer. But Mick Foley fully committed to the madness, famously pulling his own hair out during interviews. He understood that without a genuine emotional connection to the audience, the costume was meaningless. Fans can always sense authentic commitment, and Foley gave them everything he had. The goal was to build him as a legitimate threat to The Undertaker, and Foley was willing to try absolutely anything to achieve that. Jerry Briscoe fondly recalled a saying that Foley would not turn down anything but the bed covers. However, this fearless dedication presented a massive challenge for management. They had to figure out how to stop him from accidentally killing himself in the ring. The Undertaker and Mankind spent months laying a massive foundation, competing in 7 major pay-per-view matches and 10 television matches, touring the globe together. But by the summer of 1998, Foley felt his character had hit a plateau. He knew he needed to do something drastic, something that would permanently add to their legacy rather than detract from it. The producers decided to utilize the newly developed Hell in a Cell concept. Traditional steel cage matches in the World Wrestling Federation required competitors to escape over the top or through the door. The innovation of Hell in a Cell was adding a steel roof, ensuring both men went in, but only one would walk out. The inaugural cell match between Shawn Michaels and The Undertaker was viewed as an absolute masterpiece, a mile marker in wrestling history. Foley watched that first cell match in pure awe. He openly admitted that he lacked the athletic ability to replicate the incredible maneuvers performed by Michaels. Knowing he was scheduled to step into that same structure with The Undertaker some 9 months later, Foley sought advice from his mentor, Terry Funk. During a brainstorming session, Funk started laughing and jokingly suggested that they should start the match on the roof of the cage, and that Foley should be thrown off. Funk meant it purely as a dark joke. But as Funk stopped laughing, Foley looked at him with dead seriousness and stated that he thought he could actually survive that. The idea rooted itself deep in Foley's mind. He casually pitched the concept of being thrown off the cell to The Undertaker and Vince McMahon. McMahon was initially completely against the idea of throwing his talent off a towering steel structure. However, Foley was dead set on the stunt, eventually convincing both men to agree. At this stage in his life, Foley was not viewing this match as the beginning of a grand second act in his career. He was simply trying to keep his head above water, fully believing that once his current contract run was finished, his career would be over. The Undertaker trusted Foley's judgment, operating on the principle that if Foley could envision the stunt, he could safely execute it. As the broadcast began, commentators Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler set the stage, emphasizing the sheer danger of the structure. The pressure on Foley was immense. He had to follow a legendary match while compensating for his own lack of agility. Backstage, producer Jerry Briscoe sat at the main monitor bank, essentially piloting the broadcast for what would become an unforgettable night. No one in the audience, and very few people backstage, knew what to anticipate. Foley's goal was to start the bout in a manner no one had ever witnessed. As Mankind's music hit, instead of entering the locked door, he immediately began scaling the outside of the steel mesh. Inside the arena, there was a collective wave of shock. Even the commentators were completely in the dark, questioning why he was going up before the bell had even rung. Despite assuring management that he was comfortable with the stunt, Foley later admitted he was actually terrified of heights. As The Undertaker made his long, deliberate entrance, Foley stood on the roof, desperately trying to figure out how to climb back down gracefully without ruining his reputation. But he stayed the course, daring The Undertaker to meet him on the roof. The match officially commenced nearly 20 feet in the air. This immediately created a profound psychological fear. The top section of the cage was secured only by plastic zip ties, with roughly 600 pounds of human weight moving across it. The mesh began sagging dangerously by about a foot. The terrifying sound of plastic zip ties snapping echoed through the arena. The original plan called for Foley to attempt a suplex on The Undertaker, which would be countered due to the structural instability. The two men traded heavy punches, moving precariously close to the edge of the cage, directly above the broadcast tables. Even the most seasoned veterans watching backstage believed it was too dangerous to execute a fall from that height. The margin for error was terrifyingly small. Looking down at the announcer table, which appeared as small as a dollhouse from that elevation, the reality of the danger set in. Then, the moment that stopped the wrestling world occurred. The Undertaker grabbed Mankind and violently flung a 300-pound human being off the roof. Foley plummeted through the air, crashing with sickening force directly through the Spanish broadcast table. According to those watching, it felt as though time slowed down. Yet the impact happened in the blink of an eye. The catastrophic crash sent shockwaves through the arena. Broadcaster Jim Ross famously shouted in pure horror. Backstage, the locker room erupted in absolute panic. Witnesses described the scene as being akin to watching a severe automobile accident. Many honestly believed Foley was dead. It was a stunt so dangerous, so unprecedented, that it blew everyone's mind. In the arena, there was an audible gasp of terror from the 16,000 fans. At home, families watched in stunned silence. Colette Foley, watching with their two young children, desperately tried to soothe them by claiming it was all fake, while secretly panicking in her own mind. The stunt was horrifyingly believable because the danger was legitimate. A slight miscalculation by The Undertaker could have resulted in Foley missing the table entirely, landing on the concrete floor, or crashing into the spectators. Miraculously, Foley had visualized the fall perfectly. In mid-air, he rotated his body to land as flatly as possible on the wooden desk, which acted as a crucial cushion that likely saved his life. The Spanish commentator, Hugo Savinovic, barely managed to dive out of the way before the impact. The ringside area immediately filled with personnel. Terry Funk was the first to reach the wreckage, desperately checking if Foley was conscious. Dr. Francois Petit, a highly respected physician with an extensive background in martial arts, rushed from the medical room upon hearing the news. According to the medical staff, Foley had landed terribly on his back and further damaged a previously dislocated shoulder. The emergency medical technicians struggled to navigate the gurney to the ringside area, ultimately forcing the production crew to physically raise the massive steel cell just to extract him. As Foley was strapped to the stretcher, the audience and the commentators believed the terrifying ordeal was finally over. But as he was being wheeled up the aisle, the intoxicating roar of the crowd seeped into Foley's consciousness. Against the frantic pleas of the medical staff, the referees, and the producers screaming for him to stop, Foley rose from the stretcher, driven by an incomprehensible mix of adrenaline and sheer madness. He began limping back toward the ring. He was determined to finish what he started, regardless of the physical cost. Backstage personnel watched in absolute disbelief, questioning how his broken body could even stand, let alone climb the structure a second time. Yet, simultaneously, industry veterans recognized that this specific moment of superhuman resilience was exactly what transformed Foley into a legendary superstar. The fans were witnessing a man who simply refused to be stopped. Foley slowly scaled the cage once more, meeting The Undertaker back on the sagging roof. The next planned sequence was supposed to be relatively safe. They had agreed on a chokeslam maneuver that would intentionally cause the mesh to break slightly, allowing The Undertaker to stuff Foley down into the ring below. However, the structural integrity of the cage had been compromised far beyond their calculations. When The Undertaker executed the chokeslam, the metal roof completely gave way. This was not planned. Foley plummeted straight through the top of the cell, free falling into the ring below. He did not hit a padded surface. The ring mat essentially covers wooden boards reinforced by steel, feeling much like solid cement upon impact. To make matters unimaginably worse, a heavy steel folding chair that had been resting on the roof fell directly behind him, striking Foley brutally in the face as he hit the mat. According to all accounts, this second fall was vastly more terrifying than the first. The backstage area descended into total chaos. Producers tried frantically to contact the executives. Colette Foley watched her husband lie motionless on the television screen, furious that he had seemingly hidden this second, highly dangerous stunt from her. But Foley had not hidden it. This was a legitimate, horrific accident. For the first time in his career, Mick Foley was knocked out completely cold. Medical staff and officials flooded the cage. Dr. Petit and Terry Funk rushed into the ring, genuinely fearing that they were witnessing the end of Foley's life. The Undertaker looked down from the broken roof, visibly shaken, instructing Funk to verify if Foley was still breathing. For 42 agonizing seconds, Foley remained unresponsive. Realizing the match was on the verge of being legitimately terminated, Terry Funk took matters into his own hands. In a brilliant piece of improvisational psychology, Funk attacked The Undertaker, drawing the focus of the cameras and the audience away from the medical crisis, buying precious time for Foley to recover. In modern times, a match with this level of trauma would be immediately stopped. But in that era, the show pressed on. When Foley finally regained consciousness, his first sight was Terry Funk's shoes. Relying on pure muscle memory, he somehow managed to stand. The visual image of Foley at that moment is etched into the annals of television history. He was a battered, bloodied mess. Yet, even in a concussed state, the performer inside him took over. Feeling a massive wound underneath his lower lip, he deliberately stuck his tongue through the hole in his face to create a shocking visual for the cameras. And chillingly, he smiled. It was then that viewers noticed something lodged in his nose. The impact of the steel chair had knocked out his teeth. According to the medical evaluation, Foley had been breathing so heavily that he actually inhaled one of his broken teeth, which then traveled up through his throat and lodged firmly in his nasal passage. The sheer reality of the pain and the drama resonated perfectly with the audience. But the match was not over. Foley signaled for his signature move, introducing thousands of sharp metal thumbtacks into the ring. In a final display of ultimate sacrifice, The Undertaker slammed Foley violently into the bed of tacks. Foley purposefully rolled his body to ensure he was covered in the sharp metal, pushing past the threshold of pain, entirely consumed by the adrenaline of the moment. Finally, after 17 minutes of unimaginable brutality, the match concluded with The Undertaker securing the victory. The 16,000 fans in the Pittsburgh Civic Arena had witnessed a spectacle unlike anything in history. When the stretcher was brought out a second time, Foley waved it off, sparking an eruption of respect from the crowd. This authenticity, this willingness to sacrifice his own well-being, solidified an unbreakable bond with the audience. However, the immediate aftermath was fraught with tension. Foley's family had been left in agonizing suspense. He usually called his wife immediately after his matches to confirm his safety. But on the one night she desperately needed that call, the phone remained silent for hours. When he finally made contact, Colette was furious, screaming that their children genuinely thought he had died. This event fundamentally shifted her perspective. She could no longer blindly trust that he would prioritize his safety over the performance. Backstage, the locker room was in awe. Vince McMahon sought out Foley immediately. According to witnesses, McMahon sincerely thanked Foley for his incredible sacrifice for the company, but firmly demanded that he promise never to do anything like that again. All the while, the medical staff was meticulously plucking embedded thumbtacks from Foley's flesh, showing the severe effects of his head trauma. Foley genuinely did not remember the final moments of the bout, asking The Undertaker if they had actually performed the thumbtack sequence. The physical toll was staggering. Foley required 15 stitches just underneath his lip. He lost multiple teeth, suffered a dislocated jaw, dislocated his shoulder, and sustained a bruised kidney that plagued him for 6 weeks. Despite the severe trauma, it remains unclear if he was properly treated for a major concussion that night. Yet, from a professional standpoint, the match was a monumental catalyst. It triggered a massive career renaissance. Within 6 months of a match that Vince McMahon initially never wanted him in the company to have, Mick Foley captured the World Championship. But the bar had been raised to an incredibly dangerous height. Foley felt immense pressure to live up to his newly cemented status as the hardcore legend. He continued to take escalating risks, prioritizing the audience's reaction over his own health. Management issued warnings, cautioning him that pushing his physical limits would inevitably catch up to him. Foley understood their concerns, but fundamentally disagreed with their philosophy. Just 7 months after Hell in a Cell, Foley pushed the boundaries again in a brutally violent I Quit match against The Rock. According to the sources, Foley instructed his opponent to hold nothing back. The match devolved into a horrifying display of violence. Defenseless and handcuffed, Foley absorbed 11 unprotected, full-force chair shots to the head, completely abandoning the originally agreed-upon plan of 5 shots. This match proved deeply traumatic for his family. His young children were in the front row, sobbing uncontrollably as they watched their father being beaten. For his daughter Noelle, the memory is deeply sickening. She harbors intense hatred for the I Quit match, recognizing that a normal person could have easily died from absorbing 11 severe blows to the skull. It was a terrifying intersection where the scripted storyline resulted in highly factual, legitimate brain damage. The medical community eventually intervened. Following a disastrous appointment with the company's neurologist, Foley sought an independent medical opinion. The doctor's assessment was blunt and chilling. He strongly advised Foley to never wrestle again. Today, Foley lives with the undeniable consequences of his career choices. According to medical professionals, The accumulation of concussions, each comparable to the impact of a 25-mile-per-hour car accident, significantly increases the risk of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, a terrifying degenerative brain disease. Foley frequently experiences memory issues, sometimes struggling to remember where he lives while driving. The long-term prognosis remains a source of severe daily anxiety for his family. Foley himself admits the difficulty of facing his physical reality. However, he refuses to succumb to fear. Instead, he actively fights the cognitive decline, organizing spoken word tours and engaging with audiences across the country. He treats these performances as mental gymnastics, utilizing the stimulation of the crowd to keep his mind sharp. Looking back, Foley's relationship with the Hell in a Cell match has evolved. For years, he harbored deep resentment toward it, feeling trapped in a dark place because he believed that single, violent spectacle overshadowed his entire body of work. It took a heartfelt conversation with The Undertaker, who astutely pointed out that what they accomplished that night would outlive them both. For Foley to finally embrace his legacy. Recently, while touring a company warehouse with his daughter, Foley unexpectedly encountered the original steel cell. Touching the rusted metal, the hardcore legend broke down in tears. For a man who rarely cries, it was a profound confrontation with his own mortality. It was a stark reminder of a life-changing, incredibly scary moment where everything could have ended in an instant. He acknowledges that he is remarkably lucky to still be alive. With the modern understanding of head injuries, it is impossible to say with absolute certainty that he would make the same choices again. But Foley views his career as a canvas where he was allowed to create surreal, sublime performance art, despite the severe bumps in the road. He reflects on his journey as a magical way to make a living. The ability to command the awe of an audience, to sacrifice his physique just to hear the deafening roar of the crowd, provided him with one of the most powerful feelings in the world. You cannot point to that reckless desire for acceptance as his greatest fault without also acknowledging that it is the very reason he became an immortal legend. The date is June 28, 1998. The location is the Pittsburgh Civic Arena in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Inside this building, a sold-out crowd of 16,000 expectant fans awaits the World Wrestling Federation's King of the Ring pay-per-view event. They are here for a spectacle, but what they are about to witness will forever alter the landscape of professional wrestling. It is a night that would earn its place as perhaps the most shocking, visceral, and polarizing broadcast in the history of sports entertainment. This is the story of The Undertaker versus Mankind in Hell in a Cell. When you look back at the history of this industry, Hell in a Cell is a concept that hits you like a mallet to the consciousness. As an analyst who has sat ringside for decades, I can tell you that we always knew this match was going to be intense. We knew it was going to be violent, but nobody, not the fans, not the executives, and certainly not the commentators, knew it was going to be that extreme. You had two phenomenal talents out there that night who made a career out of pushing the envelope, until it teetered over the absolute edge. We often hear the tired cliché that professional wrestling is fake, but you cannot fake gravity. I have seen countless terrifying moments inside the squared circle across multiple promotions, but nothing frightened me quite as much as the events of that night. What left fans across the globe completely stunned was the unrelenting, almost incomprehensible punishment that Mick Foley endured. Until you watched it unfold with your own eyes, you simply did not believe that a human being could physically sustain that level of trauma and live to tell the tale. But this match was real. The pain etched on Foley's face was real. The dramatic tension that gripped the arena was entirely real. As a broadcast professional watching this unfold, I found myself cursing, screaming, and questioning the sanity of the man in the ring. Why are you doing this? It is a question that lingers to this day. Hell in a Cell's legacy persists as both an epic storytelling success and a grave cautionary tale. According to the accounts of those involved backstage, the company dodged several lethal bullets that night, It remains a dangerously crazy masterpiece. But as we peel back the layers of this documentary-style investigation, we have to ask ourselves one fundamental question. Was it truly worth it? The psychology of sacrifice. To understand the match, you have to understand the man. Everyone who steps through the ropes of a professional wrestling ring is looking for something they find missing in their own lives. For Mick Foley, the roots of his physical sacrifice began long before he ever laced up a pair of boots. Growing up, Foley was teased extensively. This bred an overwhelming, deep-seated need to be liked. He desperately craved the acceptance of others, a psychological trait that would eventually lead him to the World Wrestling Federation Championship, but one that would exact a heavy toll. According to Foley's own recollections, the turning point in his understanding of audience reaction happened during his sophomore year of college. In a bizarre stunt, he took a swig of red food coloring and executed a flying leap off a bed, landing on a stuffed atom on a hard concrete floor. Upon impact, he spit the red liquid out, simulating a gruesome injury. The reaction from his peers in the dormitory was visceral. One girl screamed that it was the most disgusting thing she had ever seen. For Foley, that scream was a revelation. It was power. He realized that if he could not make people love him through conventional means, perhaps he could captivate them by disgusting them. He needed reactions, no matter the cost. He would eventually become known globally as the hardcore legend, the man who survived hell in a cell. But long before he was a legend, he was simply a man searching for a way to stand out. Mick Foley was not your typical wrestler. A standard Foley match was notoriously brutal, heavily utilizing dangerous elements like thumbtacks, barbed wire, and even fire. According to the sources mentioned, his international excursions saw him enduring C4 explosives in Japan, getting speared through flaming tables, and taking horrifying falls directly onto exposed concrete. He subjected his physical frame to an unfathomable amount of abuse. His daughter, Noelle Foley, has noted that her father genuinely loved extracting shock from the audience, craving the loud gasps of horror from the crowd. For Mick, realism was his greatest tool. He operated under a punishing personal philosophy. He did not believe he had a good match unless he had physical trouble walking back to his hotel room. He did not necessarily enjoy the pain itself, but he found immense satisfaction in his ability to absorb it and project it into a compelling narrative for the fans. But beneath the scars and the blood was a surprisingly gentle soul. His wife of over 35 years, Colette Foley, saw past the violence. When they first met, she noticed his kind eyes and fell in love with his terrible humor and corny jokes. Their wedding song was, fittingly, Beauty and the Beast. Colette understood his profound commitment to his craft. She understood that once the adrenaline began pumping, her husband's singular drive was to ensure the fans left the arena talking about how incredible the show was, completely at his own physical risk. The road to the World Wrestling Federation. To carve out his niche, Foley developed an erratic, chaotic persona known as Cactus Jack. He was a wild, unpredictable character who operated completely outside the script. As former producer and agent Jim Cornette observed, Foley possessed an undeniable charisma. You could not take your eyes off him. He was a master of ring psychology, understanding that fans were deeply drawn to someone who appeared completely out of control. By taking the audience on a dangerous, unscripted ride, he commanded their attention, and his reputation began to soar. His journey to the top was unorthodox. According to Foley, his early bedroom furniture consisted of a simple mattress on the floor, accompanied by a black and white television and a barely functioning videocassette recorder. That machine was constantly playing Japanese wrestling tapes. He would sometimes consume 12 hours of international wrestling footage a day, studying the grueling realism and the intense storytelling where a competitor had to defeat not just their opponent, but their harsh surroundings. Japan seemed like his ultimate destination. Promoters overseas were searching for a foreign talent capable of feuding with the legendary Terry Funk Funk was considered a master at making audiences suspend their disbelief. He would eventually become a crucial mentor to Foley, and together they engaged in explosive, fiery, and incredibly violent matches across Japan. Foley was drawn to this extreme environment, often finding himself crawling on his hands and knees, viewing the agonizing pain as proof that he was achieving something extraordinary. Because of this brutal style, Foley never envisioned himself as a World Wrestling Federation superstar. At that time, the promotion was largely producing G-rated, family-friendly content. It was a sterile environment, and Foley's chaotic brand of violence did not seem to fit the corporate mold. According to talent relations executive Jim Ross and former travel partner Al Snow, Vince McMahon actively did not want to hire Mick Foley. The chairman did not think Foley was marketable or aesthetically attractive enough for his television programs. However, Jim Ross desperately needed compelling opponents for one of the company's biggest foundational stars, The Undertaker. For years, McMahon had relied on pairing The Undertaker with giant, lumbering opponents, a formula that was becoming stale and predictable. What the character truly needed was an unhinged lunatic. Ross ultimately convinced McMahon to take a gamble based on his talent evaluations. Reluctantly, McMahon agreed, reportedly stating that he would hire Foley, but on the strict condition that his face be completely covered because he viewed Foley as an absolute nobody. This mandate birthed the character of Mankind. As Hall of Famer Gerald Briscoe recalled, the creative team was tasked with building a captivating persona out of nothing. The result was a deranged, mask-wearing madman who pulled his own hair out in fits of psychotic rage. This concept could have easily been a massive failure, but it worked exclusively because of Mick Foley's total dedication. Without his desperate need to connect with the audience, the character would have been meaningless. He was willing to try absolutely anything to succeed. The conception of the Cell. By the summer of 1998, Mankind and The Undertaker had established a legendary rivalry. They had battled across the globe, competing in 7 pay-per-view matches and 10 television matches. However, Foley felt his character had hit a plateau. He believed he needed to do something monumental to add to their shared legacy, rather than let it fade. The creative direction for the King of the Ring event was to lock them inside a recently developed structure. Hell in a Cell. The standard cage matches of the era allowed competitors to win by escaping over the top or through a door. The Hell in a Cell concept changed the psychology completely by placing a roof on the structure, ensuring there was no easy escape. The inaugural Hell in a Cell match had taken place between The Undertaker and Shawn Michaels, and it was widely considered an absolute masterpiece of in-ring storytelling. Foley himself admitted that he watched that first encounter with his jaw open, recognizing that he lacked the athletic capability to perform the acrobatic maneuvers Michaels had executed. With the pressure mounting to follow a legendary predecessor, Foley sought advice from his mentor, Terry Funk. According to Foley, Funk jokingly suggested that they should start the match on top of the cage roof, and then Foley should be thrown off. While Funk intended it as a dark piece of humor, Foley stopped laughing. He looked at his mentor and realized he could actually do it. The idea embedded itself in Foley's mind. He casually pitched the concept of being thrown off the massive structure to Vince McMahon and The Undertaker. Unsurprisingly, The Undertaker was highly reluctant to hurl his opponent off the roof. However, Foley was dead set on the idea, ultimately convincing his opponent to trust him. Foley viewed this match not as a glorious second act for his career, but simply as a desperate attempt to keep his head above water. He genuinely believed that when this feud concluded, his career at the top level would be over. The fall that stopped the world. As the match was officially announced for Pittsburgh, the tension was palpable. Broadcasters Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler were kept completely in the dark, experiencing the anxiety in real time alongside the fans. Jimmy Corderas, a referee and ring crew member, sat backstage monitoring the broadcast screens, acting as the pilot for what would become an unprecedented television flight. No one knew what to anticipate. When Mankind's music hit, instead of entering the structure, he began scaling the outside of the cage. A wave of confusion and shock washed over the arena. The commentators questioned his logic. Behind the scenes, Foley had assured McMahon and The Undertaker that he was comfortable on the roof. But in reality, he was terrified of heights. As The Undertaker followed him up, the situation immediately became precarious. The roof of the cell was secured with heavy plastic zip ties. The combined weight of the two men, nearly 600 pounds, caused the mesh fencing to sag violently by about a foot. The terrifying sound of zip ties snapping echoed loudly. The structural integrity of the cell was failing in real time. The two men began exchanging strikes near the edge of the cage, directly above the commentary tables. As an analyst watching the footage, the margin for error was almost non-existent. Looking down from nearly 20 feet in the air, the commentary desks looked like fragile dollhouse furniture. Then the unthinkable happened. A 300-pound man was flung from the heavens. Mick Foley plummeted through the air in a terrifying freefall. To those watching, it felt like time slowed down, yet it happened in the blink of an eye. He crashed through the Spanish broadcast table with a sickening, violent thud. The backstage area exploded in sheer panic. Colleagues felt they had just witnessed a fatal car accident. The sound of his body hitting the table and the concrete floor beneath it was horrifying. There was an audible gasp from the crowd, a collective realization that they might have just watched a man die on live television. At home, Colette Foley sat with their two young children, desperately lying to them, repeating that it was just fake to soothe their crying, while internally, she was panicking. But miraculously, the spot had gone exactly as Foley had planned in his mind. Mid-air, he rotated his body to ensure he landed as flatly as possible on the table, attempting to cushion the fall. It was a calculated risk that saved his life, though the sheer impact was devastating. Medical personnel, including Dr. Francois Petit, immediately rushed to ringside. Terry Funk was the first to check if Foley was even conscious. The medical staff struggled to navigate the gurney through the chaotic ringside area. They eventually strapped Foley to the stretcher, fully believing the match was over. And by all logical, medical, and ethical standards, it absolutely should have been. The unplanned disaster. But Mick Foley's psychology took over. He realized that the longer he remained on the broadcast, the more engaged the audience became. As he was being wheeled up the aisle, a frightening resolve washed over him. Against the frantic pleas of officials and colleagues, Foley removed himself from the stretcher. He marched back to the ring. He was going to climb back up. The locker room watched in stunned disbelief. It was an act of absolute insanity, but it was also the exact moment that cemented Mick Foley as an immortal star in the eyes of the public. Once both men were back on the damaged roof, they prepared for the next sequence. According to the original plan, The Undertaker was supposed to deliver a chokeslam, causing the mesh fencing to gradually give way, allowing Foley to be safely lowered into the ring. That is not what happened. When The Undertaker lifted Foley and drove him into the cage, the remaining zip ties completely failed. The roof panel gave way instantly, and Foley dropped like a stone straight down to the canvas. This was not a cushioned fall. A professional wrestling ring mat is placed over solid wood and steel beams. It is roughly equivalent to hitting solid cement. As Foley slammed violently onto his back, a heavy steel folding chair that had been resting on the roof fell directly after him, striking him brutally in the face. This second fall was entirely unplanned and infinitely more dangerous. The control room erupted in sheer terror. Wives and family members watching at home thought this was the end. Colette Foley was furious, believing her husband had lied to her about the danger of the match. For the first time in his career, Mick Foley was legitimately knocked completely unconscious. Panic flooded the cage. Medical staff and officials surrounded his motionless body. The Undertaker looked down from the broken roof, and told Terry Funk to check if Foley was even alive. Funk reported back that he was breathing. The situation was so dire that the match should have been halted instantly. However, the protocol of that era did not dictate stopping the bout. Instead, they bought time. Funk ingeniously took the focus off Foley by attacking The Undertaker, getting himself thrown around to distract the audience while doctors tended to the fallen star. For 42 agonizing seconds, Foley was lost to the world. When he finally regained consciousness, his immediate focus, driven by his deep-seated need for audience reaction, was to create a memorable television image. He had suffered a massive, gaping wound underneath his lower lip. In a moment of bizarre showmanship, he pushed his tongue straight through the open wound and smiled at the camera. Adding to the grotesque visual, one of his front teeth had been violently dislodged by the steel chair. Medical professionals later concluded that he had swallowed the tooth, but due to his heavy, labored breathing, he had forcefully exhaled it upwards, lodging it inside his nasal passage. The price of greatness. The match was no longer a performance. The pain was real, the concern was real, and the look of sheer vacancy in Foley's eyes was haunting. Yet, remarkably, he insisted on finishing the bout. He demanded the introduction of thumbtacks. Running purely on adrenaline, Foley pushed his battered body beyond the limits of human endurance. He purposely rolled through the scattered tacks, ensuring they pierced his flesh to give the fans maximum visual impact. Finally, after 17 grueling minutes, The Undertaker mercifully secured the victory. The Pittsburgh crowd of 16,000 went absolutely insane. They had witnessed a man refuse to be stopped, and they rewarded him with their total devotion. But the aftermath was sobering. Backstage, Vince McMahon approached Foley. While expressing deep gratitude for what Foley had done for the company, McMahon sternly warned him never to do anything like that again. Doctors spent the remainder of the evening pulling thumbtacks out of Foley's flesh while he was completely disoriented, asking The Undertaker if they had even used the thumbtacks in the match yet. The physical toll was immense. Foley required 15 stitches under his lip, lost 2 teeth, suffered a dislocated jaw, a dislocated shoulder, and endured a bruised kidney that plagued him for 6 weeks. Yet, the professional reward was undeniable. That single match revolutionized his career. Within 6 months of the event, the man whom Vince McMahon originally did not want on television was crowned the World Wrestling Federation champion. However, the bar for violence had been irreparably raised. Foley felt a crushing obligation to his moniker as the hardcore legend. He believed he owed it to the audience to constantly deliver unprecedented spectacle. This dangerous mindset culminated just 7 months later during a horrific I Quit match against The Rock. Despite warnings from executives like Jim Ross, Foley proceeded with a shockingly violent script. According to sources, Foley instructed his opponent to hit him with tremendous force. The original plan called for 5 steel chair shots to the head while Foley's hands were handcuffed behind his back. Instead, Foley absorbed 11 unprotected shots to the skull. The broadcast was deeply uncomfortable to watch. Foley's young children sat at ringside, unable to separate the fictional storyline from the factual brain damage their father was suffering in real time. His daughter, Noelle, admits that she has blocked out memories of her father wrestling, sickened by the reality that 11 brutal blows to the head could have easily killed a normal person. Colette Foley refers to it as one of the worst days of her life. The reality of tomorrow. Today, the wrestling industry asks itself, when is it enough? Back then, the long-term effects of concussions were heavily misunderstood. Today, the medical community knows that taking bumps in a wrestling ring is akin to enduring a 25-mile-per-hour car crash on a nightly basis. Mick Foley is now paying the steep price for his pursuit of fame. Over his career, he suffered concussion upon concussion. According to Foley, after suffering severe memory issues, such as forgetting where he lived while driving, he visited independent neurologists. Their prognosis was grim. They firmly told him that if he continued to wrestle, he would end up crippled, and heavily advised him to never step foot in the ring again. The looming specter of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, widely known as CTE, casts a long shadow over the Foley family. It is a terrifying degenerative brain disease linked to repetitive trauma. His family lives in constant, daily fear of what his neurological health will look like in 10 or 20 years. To fight the cognitive decline, Foley has taken to performing spoken word shows, utilizing the stage as a form of mental gymnastics to keep his brain sharp. The roar of the crowd, the stimulation of the audience, it is the very medicine that keeps him moving forward. For many years, Foley harbored deep resentment toward Hell in a Cell, feeling trapped in a dark place because it was the singular event that defined his entire existence. He felt that despite all his championships and charity work, he was only known for falling off a cage. However, a conversation with The Undertaker helped him embrace his legacy. The Undertaker reminded him that what they created that night in Pittsburgh would outlive them both. Mick Foley sacrificed his physical and mental well-being for the roar of the crowd. He sought to create sublime, surreal performance art, and on certain magical nights, he achieved exactly that. When reflecting on the terrifying reality of his injuries, even Foley admits that there is no reward big enough to truly cover the risks he took. Recently, while visiting the company warehouse with his daughter, Foley unexpectedly encountered the original cell structure. A man known for absorbing unimaginable pain touched the rusted steel mesh and began to weep. It was a profound realization of his own mortality. He understood how incredibly lucky he is to simply be alive. Hell in a Cell was a masterpiece of sports entertainment, born from one man's desperate need to be loved by total strangers. It is a testament to human endurance, but it remains a sobering reminder of the devastating, permanent costs of achieving immortality inside the squared circle. Step into the shadows of sports entertainment history. What you are about to explore is not merely a recounting of an athletic contest. It is a profound psychological study of human endurance, a cautionary tale of ambition, and a dissection of an evening that forever altered the landscape of professional wrestling. When we look back at the annals of the industry, certain dates are permanently etched into the collective memory of the audience. June 28, 1998 is one of those dates. The event was the World Wrestling Federation's King of the Ring pay-per-view, held inside the cavernous walls of the Pittsburgh Civic Arena in front of 16,000 expectant fans. The match was designed to be a spectacle. The Undertaker versus Mankind in a structure known as Hell in a Cell. But what transpired that night transcended the boundaries of a scripted performance. It became a dangerously chaotic masterpiece, a night where the very real forces of gravity, impact, and human fragility collided with the insatiable desire to entertain. As observers, we must ask ourselves, when does the pursuit of greatness cross the line into self-destruction? And more importantly, as the dust settles and the years pass, was the sacrifice truly worth it? To understand the sheer madness of that night, we must first understand the man behind the mask. The man known to the world as Mankind, Cactus Jack, and the Hardcore Legend. His real name is Mick Foley. According to his own deeply personal accounts, everyone who steps into the world of professional wrestling is searching for something missing in their own lives. For Foley, a self-described victim of relentless childhood teasing, the driving force was an overwhelming need to be liked. He desperately craved the acceptance of total strangers. This psychological foundation was laid long before he ever set foot in a World Wrestling Federation ring. Foley has recounted a defining moment from his time as a college sophomore. Seeking a reaction from his peers, he filled his mouth with red food coloring and launched himself off a bed, crashing onto a stuffed animal resting on a harsh concrete floor. Upon impact, he expelled the red liquid, creating a horrifying visual. The reaction from the onlookers in the dormitory was immediate. When a fellow student expressed absolute disgust, Foley did not feel shame. He felt power. It was a profound realization that would define his entire career. If he could not force people to love him, he could certainly force them to be disgusted by him. He just needed to elicit a reaction. This relentless pursuit of a reaction birthed a style of performance art that pushed the physical limits of the human body. Foley developed a persona named Cactus Jack, a wild, unpredictable character who possessed a strange, undeniable charisma. As former producer Jim Cornette noted, Foley was a master of in-ring psychology. He understood that audiences were captivated by performers who appeared completely out of control, individuals who seemed to be rebelling against the established script. By taking the audience on a journey of perceived legitimate danger, he forced all eyes upon himself. His journey to international prominence was paved with unimaginable pain. In his early years, his life consisted of a mattress on the floor, a black and white television, and a video cassette recorder that barely functioned. On that machine, Foley would consume up to 12 hours of Japanese wrestling tapes a day. He was captivated by the realism and the brutal storytelling. In these matches, a competitor was not merely fighting an opponent, they were fighting the environment itself. It was in Japan that Foley believed he would forge his legacy. The promoters were searching for a foreign talent capable of entering a fierce rivalry with Terry Funk, a man widely considered the greatest of all time for his unparalleled ability to make audiences suspend their disbelief. Funk became a mentor to Foley. Together, they engaged in a series of explosive, bloody, and fiery death matches. Foley willingly subjected his body to thumbtacks, barbed wire, and even composition for explosives. To him, the extreme physical trauma was not a burden. It was proof that he had achieved something truly special. It was his unique way of standing out in an industry filled with larger-than-life athletes. Yet, despite this international infamy, the doors of the World Wrestling Federation remained closed to him for quite some time. During that era, the company was operating under a general audience rating. The programming was largely traditional, and a performer who relied on extreme, visceral punishment did not fit the corporate mold. According to Al Snow, a former superstar and one of Foley's closest traveling companions, the chairman of the company, Vince McMahon, simply did not see the appeal. McMahon reportedly did not find Foley marketable or aesthetically pleasing for television. It took the persistence of Jim Ross, who was serving as the vice president of talent relations, to convince McMahon to take a chance on the eccentric brawler. Ross recognized a profound, untapped potential. The company was in desperate need of compelling adversaries for one of their most significant attractions, The Undertaker. McMahon had spent years feeding massive, towering giants to The Undertaker, a formula that had grown stale and uninspiring. Ross argued that what The Undertaker truly needed was not another giant, but a lunatic, a performer entirely unhinged. McMahon eventually relented, but his concession came with a strict caveat. According to behind-the-scenes accounts, McMahon agreed to bring Foley in, but insisted on covering his face with a leather mask, operating under the assumption that the man beneath it was inherently unmarketable. This mandate birthed the character of Mankind. As Hall of Famer Gerald Briscoe recalled, the creative team was tasked with building a compelling character out of seemingly nothing. Yet, this bizarre, dark persona would not have succeeded with anyone other than Mick Foley. Foley poured his entire soul into the character, committing to the absurdity with such fierce dedication that the audience could not help but invest in him. As Jim Cornette observed, an audience invests their time and money in their belief in the performer. Foley understood that risking his own physical well-being allowed the audience to believe in him completely. The rivalry between Mankind and The Undertaker became legendary, spanning 7 distinct pay-per-view events and 10 television matches across the globe. However, by the summer of 1998, Foley felt his character had reached a plateau. He believed he needed to do something monumental to elevate his legacy, rather than allowing it to fade. The opportunity presented itself when producers decided to revive a relatively new, Terrifying concept, the Hell in a Cell match. Traditional cage matches in the company required a competitor to escape by climbing over the top or walking through the door. The Hell in a Cell was fundamentally different. As originally conceived, a roof enclosed the structure. Two men would enter, and theoretically, they would be trapped inside until a victor emerged. The inaugural Hell in a Cell match had taken place months prior between The Undertaker and Shawn Michaels, setting an incredibly high standard that many consider technically unmatched to this day. Foley studied that first match with a sense of awe, realizing he possessed none of the athletic agility that Michaels displayed. He needed a different approach. During a conversation with his mentor, Terry Funk, a joke was made about starting the match on top of the cage and being thrown off. While Funk was merely laughing at the absurdity of the idea, a switch flipped in Foley's mind. He looked at Funk and stated, with chilling absolute certainty, that he could execute that fall. Foley became obsessed with the concept. He casually pitched the idea of being thrown from the roof to both Mr. McMahon and The Undertaker. The Undertaker was heavily resistant to the idea of throwing his opponent from such a perilous height. But Foley's determination was unrelenting. He eventually convinced his colleagues to proceed. At that time, Foley did not view this stunt as the dawn of a new era in his career. Rather, he saw it as a desperate measure to keep his head above water, fully believing that once this chapter concluded, his career might very well end with it. The pressure mounting on Foley as he walked down the aisle that fateful June night is difficult to quantify. Referee Jimmy Corderas, who was stationed backstage watching the monitors, recalled the palpable tension. Broadcasters Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler were entirely in the dark, experiencing the unfolding events with the same raw shock as the fans watching at home. The strategy Foley deployed was designed to subvert all expectations. As The Undertaker made his methodical entrance, Foley bypassed the locked door and began scaling the chain-link exterior of the structure. The shock echoing through the Pittsburgh arena was visceral. However, what the audience did not know was that Foley, despite his fearless exterior, harbored a deep fear of heights. Standing nearly 20 feet above the concrete floor, surrounded by blinding lights and an unforgiving steel grate, he found himself internally questioning how he could gracefully climb back down without ruining his professional reputation. When The Undertaker joined him on the roof, the structural integrity of the cell was immediately compromised. The top panels were secured with heavy-duty zip ties designed to hold the mesh in place, but not designed to support the combined 600 pounds of two massive athletes engaged in combat. As they stepped across the surface, the metal mesh sagged violently beneath their boots. Observers could actually hear the distinct sound of industrial zip ties snapping under the immense pressure. Despite the crumbling battlefield beneath them, the two men approached the edge of the structure. Those watching, including seasoned veterans in the back, convinced themselves that the performers would pull back. The margin for error was non-existent. Below them sat the Spanish announcer table, appearing as small as a dollhouse from that terrifying elevation. Then the unthinkable occurred. With a brutal heave, The Undertaker launched a 300-pound human being off the edge of the cell. Foley plummeted through the air, completely at the mercy of gravity. For those witnessing it, the descent seemed to occur in agonizing slow motion. Yet it was over in the blink of an eye. Foley crashed violently through the Spanish announcer desk, narrowly missing commentator Hugo Savinovic, who had bailed out of his chair mere seconds before the impact. The sound of the collision was sickening. It was not a choreographed bump. It was the horrifying sound of a human body suffering a catastrophic impact. Backstage, the locker room erupted in sheer panic. Witnesses likened the visual to watching a horrific automobile accident. Many genuinely believed they had just watched a man lose his life on live television. At ringside, the concern was palpable and immediate. Medical personnel, including Dr. Francois Petit, a highly trained professional who had served as the company's physician for nearly 5 years, rushed to the wreckage. Terry Funk was among the first to reach the debris, desperately checking to see if Foley was even conscious. A gurney was swiftly deployed. The spectacle of Foley being loaded onto the stretcher was not an angle. It was an absolute medical necessity. The match, by all logical metrics, was over. Yet, as the gurney began to move up the aisle, a terrifying realization washed over Foley. Despite the immense trauma, his mind calculated that the longer he remained in the arena, the more deeply the audience became engaged. Fueled by an unfathomable rush of adrenaline and an absolute refusal to quit, Foley rolled off the gurney, to the absolute dismay of officials, medical staff, and his own peers screaming for him to stop. Foley began to climb the cell a second time. If the first fall was a calculated, albeit incredibly dangerous stunt, what happened next was a terrifying accident that nearly ended in tragedy. The performers had agreed on a sequence where a choke slam would cause the roof's mesh to gradually give way, creating a visual of Foley being suspended or stuffed through the breaking wire. That is not what happened. When The Undertaker elevated Foley and drove him downward, the entire panel gave way instantly. Foley plummeted straight through the roof, free-falling to the ring below. He did not hit a forgiving surface. The wrestling ring is constructed of tightly pulled canvas over heavy wooden boards and steel beams, offering an impact similar to solid cement. Worse still, as Foley fell, a heavy metal folding chair that had been resting on the roof fell directly alongside him. When Foley impacted the mat, the metal chair violently struck him squarely in the face. The reaction from the audience and the broadcasters was no longer one of mere shock. It was pure, unadulterated horror. Foley lay motionless in the center of the ring. For 42 agonizing seconds, the hardcore legend was legitimately unconscious. Backstage, the panic intensified. His family, watching from home, was subjected to a nightmare. The illusion of performance was shattered. The trauma unfolding before their eyes was an indisputable medical emergency. Inside the ring, The Undertaker looked down at the lifeless body of his colleague. He immediately instructed Terry Funk to enter the ring to check if Foley was still breathing. Realizing the severity of the situation, Funk brilliantly improvised, physically provoking The Undertaker to draw attention away from the medical crisis and buy precious time for Foley to recover his senses. In any other era of sports entertainment, the match would have been immediately halted. But in that specific time and place, the show pushed forward. When Foley finally regained consciousness, the first thing his eyes focused on were the shoes of Terry Funk. Slowly, the realization of his surroundings returned. Through sheer, inexplicable willpower, Foley returned to his feet. The visual he presented to the camera remains one of the most haunting in television history. He sported a massive wound beneath his lower lip. With a macabre sense of showmanship, he pushed his tongue through the gaping hole, smiling through a mask of his own blood. Lodged inside his nasal passage was one of his own teeth, forcefully relocated by the impact of the steel chair. Medical professionals later theorized that the tooth had initially been knocked into his throat, and in his desperate struggle to breathe, he had literally inhaled it back up into his nasal cavity. Despite being severely concussed and suffering from multiple catastrophic injuries, Foley insisted on executing the final act of his planned performance. He introduced a bag of sharp thumbtacks to the canvas. In a state of pure survival mode, where adrenaline completely overrides the nervous system's pain response, Foley was slammed violently into the sea of tacks, ensuring his body was completely covered in the sharp metal pins. After 17 minutes of unrelenting brutality, The Undertaker finally secured the victory. As the bell rang, the Pittsburgh crowd erupted in a mixture of awe and relief. The stretcher was brought out once more, but true to his legendary persona, Foley waved it off, walking out under his own power, while the crowd showered him with an incredible roar of appreciation. The audience knew they had not just witnessed a match. They had witnessed a man sacrifice his physical well-being for their entertainment. However, The aftermath of that evening painted a sobering picture of the realities of professional wrestling. Backstage, an emotional Vince McMahon approached Foley. While expressing deep gratitude for Foley's sacrifices for the company, McMahon sternly demanded that Foley promise never to do anything like that again, even as medical staff painstakingly plucked thumbtacks from his flesh. The physical toll was staggering. Foley suffered a dislocated jaw, a dislocated shoulder, a severely bruised kidney that plagued him for 6 weeks, missing teeth, and 15 facial stitches. Furthermore, he endured an undocumented severe concussion. The emotional toll on his family was equally devastating. Foley's wife, Colette, who had been his partner for over 35 years, waited in terrifying silence at home. Foley had established a routine of calling her immediately after major performances to ensure she knew he was safe. On this night, the call was severely delayed. When he finally reached her, her fear had transformed into furious anger, screaming that their young children believed they had just watched their father die on television. From that night forward, the quiet trust she held that her husband would protect his safety was replaced by an ever-present anxiety. Yet, from a professional standpoint, the match achieved exactly what Foley had hoped. It sparked a miraculous career renaissance. Within 6 months, the man McMahon, once deemed unmarketable, was crowned the world champion. The roar of the crowd and the rush of adrenaline proved to be a highly addictive combination. Foley felt an immense pressure to constantly outdo himself, to live up to the moniker of the hardcore legend. This relentless drive led him back into the abyss just 7 months later, in a deeply controversial I Quit match against The Rock. Despite warnings from colleagues regarding the dangers of excessive blood loss and trauma, Foley pushed forward. The original plan called for Foley to take 5 unprotected strikes to the head with a steel chair, while his hands were bound in handcuffs. In the heat of the moment, the plan escalated wildly. Foley ultimately absorbed 11 unprotected, full-force chair shots to the skull. The footage of that match remains incredibly difficult to watch. For Foley's young daughter, Noelle, the footage was deeply traumatizing. Looking back, she correctly identified the grim reality. Taking 11 unprotected strikes to the head could easily end the life of an average human being. It was a sickening display of violence that resulted in legitimate brain damage, all in the service of a television storyline. This brings us to the profound, dark reality that shadows this industry. Back in the late 1990s, the medical community and the performers themselves did not fully comprehend the long-term devastation of repeated concussions. Experts now equate the impact of taking a standard bump in the ring to enduring a 25-mile-per-hour automobile collision. Stacking concussion upon concussion leads directly to the terrifying reality of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, commonly known as CTE. The medical community eventually intervened. During an independent evaluation with a neurologist outside the jurisdiction of the Wrestling Federation, Foley was given a stark, undeniable ultimatum. The doctor informed him that while he could shop around for a physician willing to clear him, the medical truth was that he should never step foot in a wrestling ring again. The risk of permanent crippling injury was absolute. Today, Mick Foley pays the steep price for the fame and adulation he achieved. He has openly discussed the terrifying neurological symptoms he experiences, including instances where he would drive his vehicle and suddenly lose all memory of where he lived. His family lives with the daily, agonizing fear of the long-term progression of his brain trauma, wondering what his cognitive state will be in 10 or 20 years. Foley himself acknowledges the grim reality of his condition. Facing the daunting prospect of neurological decline, he has chosen a path of proactive resistance rather than living in fear of the unknown. He regularly tours the country performing spoken word shows, viewing the nightly performances as essential mental gymnastics to keep his cognitive function sharp. The stimulation of a live audience, the roar that defined his entire existence, continues to be his lifeblood. Reflecting on his legacy, Foley admits to experiencing periods of profound darkness. For years, he harbored a deep resentment toward the Hell in a Cell match, feeling that his entire body of work had been reduced to a single evening of chaotic violence. He felt as though despite all he had given, he had accomplished nothing of true artistic merit. It was a conversation with his legendary opponent, The Undertaker, that shifted his perspective. The Undertaker poignantly reminded him that what they created that night in Pittsburgh would outlive them both. It was a moment of unparalleled awe, a spectacle that etched their names into the bedrock of sports history. This realization brought Foley a sense of peace. During a visit to the company's historical archives with his daughter, he unexpectedly encountered the original steel panels of the cell. In a rare display of vulnerability, the man who had built his career on withstanding unimaginable pain placed his hand against the rusted steel and began to weep. It was a visceral acknowledgement of the terrifying proximity he had shared with his own mortality. Looking back at the trajectory of his career, Mick Foley recognizes that there is no financial or professional reward substantial enough to truly offset the physical risks he absorbed. Knowing what the medical community now knows about traumatic brain injuries, it is a haunting exercise to wonder if he would have altered his path. Yet, he views his career not merely as an act of self-destruction, but as a bizarre, sublime form of performance art. The wrestling ring was a canvas, and despite the bumps in the road, he used his own body to paint a masterpiece that generated one of the most powerful feelings in the world. The story of Mick Foley and the Hell in a Cell is the ultimate paradox of professional wrestling. It is a testament to the miraculous durability of the human spirit, and a grim warning about the irreversible consequences of seeking immortality.